So not really a whole lot of improvement on the icy state of the state of Pennsylvania. We have icicles hanging off the Range Rover, so hopefully we'll get some warmer weather soon. All right, here we have our 2019 Ram Rebel. We've got our wheels and tires in the bed. We've already got it hooked up on the lift. It's time to raise this thing up, tear it apart. What's up, everybody? Welcome to Hammered Out Motorsports. I hope you guys are having an awesome day. In the shop, it's about 38 degrees right now, but we're ready to get the lift kit put in the Rebel so we can get those tires to fit, and hopefully we're gonna have enough clearance. They say we will, so I got a lot of faith in all the manufacturers that I've been dealing with. So let's get everything laid out on the table and show you guys what we got. So here it is, everybody. We have a Readylift 3.5-inch SST lift. Now, the reason I didn't go any higher is because when you get into the 6-inch lifts, you have to take the front diff out, you gotta do a bunch of cutting and relocating the brackets and all that kind of stuff. And with a kit like this, if you were to want to trade the truck in down the road, all this stuff can be removed very easily and go right back to stock with no problem whatsoever. So a little rundown on our parts we have here. We have our tubular upper A-arm, which I think is a lot more rigid than the factory one. The factory one's got like a stamped steel top and then like a composite on the bottom. And this one here will actually give you a better ball joint angle because when you do put your spacers in, it's gonna change the angle of that ball joint, and this actually relocates it so it's running nice and true, so you're not gonna have any problems with premature wear. Also has a grease zerk on the top for servicing it. And over here we have our red polyurethane bushings, which is going to go well with our accent color. Also, we have the lower spring spacers. This is going to go in between our upper mount on our strut and our factory spring. And then over here we have our upper spacer, which is going to go onto the top existing bolts of our upper strut mount. And then these studs are going to go into the saddle where our original ones were. And then for the rear, we have these rear spring spacers. And then we have our bump stop extenders, all of our hardware, instructions. We should be good to go. All right, so first up, we're gonna grab our tape measure, give a measurement of our front ride height as well as our rear before we install these wheels, tires, and lift kit, and see exactly how high this kit is gonna get you. So on our front, we're sitting at about 38 1/4, and on the rear we're looking about 38 3/4. So now let's get this thing up in the air, get the wheels and tires off, and we can start disassembling our front and rear suspension. So first up, we're going to take a 13mm, remove the retaining bolt for our brake line. This is going to allow the steel line to kind of move out a little bit, because when we got all this disconnected, we don't want to put stress on the rubber line that goes right into it. So we're gonna take that bolt out, allow that to move freely. Next up, we're gonna take some side cutters, just kind of cut this zip tie that holds our ABS wire. Just be careful you don't cut the wire. Get that out of the way. Now I'm gonna take my 21mm wobble socket, get onto the one for the upper ball joint, and remove it. Now that our nut is removed, I'm just gonna take a hammer, give it a nice tap right there, just so it can release the upper ball joint from the taper and the knuckle. There we go. Next up, we'll grab a 36mm socket and remove our axle nut. So now, luckily enough, this truck only has 3,000 miles, so the axle comes out of the spindle pretty easily. So I'm just gonna pull it back a little bit, get some anti-seize, put that on those splines, just so it doesn't rust in the future. And next I'm gonna take my 18mm wobble on an extension, kind of get it in behind here, get onto our sway bar, and remove the nut. And this is something I did just for me personally. I took a ratchet strap, ran it over to the frame, and then over to one of the studs. Just put a lug nut on here just so this won't fall off. And then I kind of tightened it up just to take any kind of strain off the ABS line and your rubber brake hose. Also at this point in the instructions, they're telling you to support the lower control arm, and all of my jack stands are either too short and all of my high lift jacks are a little bit too high to be working at this level. So by doing this with the ratchet strap, we should be okay. This isn't gonna move much, but I think they're just trying to do that just so you don't put too much strain over here. So by using this strap method, I think we should be good to go. So now we're ready to remove the lower bolt for the strut assembly. And on the head of the bolt side, you're gonna want a 21mm, and on the other side, I've got a 15/16 wrench. I'm gonna run that out, and then we're ready to take our upper hardware off and get the strut out of the vehicle. Now we're ready to remove our upper strut bolts. Got a 16 millimeter on my air ratchet. We'll just get it up on top. These inner fenders are pretty flimsy, so you can kind of just push them out of the way. Get onto the nut. So now that we have the strut out of the truck, got it here in the vise, and I've got these two spring compressors on here. What we're gonna do is just kind of tighten down evenly side for side, get the spring to nicely compress, take the pressure off of the upper mount, and we can remove the nut that actually holds the mount to the strut, and then we can take this off and get our new spacer installed. Now that you can see that the upper mount is free from the spring, we know there's enough tension taken up that we can get our upper nut removed safely without anything kind of flying apart on you, and everything is nicely being held by our spring compressors. There we go, 18 millimeter socket. Get our upper mount removed, and the dust shield comes along with it. Now we're going to separate our upper mount from the dust sleeve and the rubber. Give that a quick wipe down as well. And then we're going to reinstall the dust sleeve and upper rubber mount onto the spring. Make sure everything is nicely in place. And then we're going to put our factory upper strut mount into our new spacer. I'm going to set that on top, making sure that our paint line is still lining up with our rubber mount below. And then we're going to tighten up our spring compressors once again, so we can compensate for this extra aluminum piece that we're adding to our spring. All right, so at this point, I did release the tension on the spring. You can see how high it actually is. I'm actually almost to the end of these spring compressors, because my plan is now, I don't trust to put as much pressure as is going to be required to get the spring all the way down to get the spacer in with this setup here. These are fairly inexpensive spring compressors. They're mainly meant for changing struts themselves, not actually adding an extra block. So I don't want one of these to break and have this thing go shooting through my floor of my mezzanine. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it down to a shop that actually has a full-size spring compressor, and then we're going to compress this strut just like the instructions say by putting the spacer in the top mount and then pushing it down from the top instead of trying to compress the spring itself. I just think this is going to be a safer way to go. So I'm going to take the other side out, I'm going to take both these over and get them assembled. Alright, so I went to the shop and they were pretty busy today, which is understandable. It's like 4 o'clock, so end of the day, trying to get stuff done. So I ended up just going to the auto parts store and getting another set of these spring compressors. They're about $45 for a set of them. So now, after using 4 of them, and now I gotta say I don't necessarily recommend doing it this way because you are putting a lot of pressure on this spring. And just if one of these were to fail, I mean, I do feel better having 4 of them on there, just because if there was an issue, at least you have 3 others to hold it. And then you can kind of, you know, back it off and get out of a potentially dangerous situation. But I do recommend taking this to a shop that has a proper strut compressor. But I did end up getting away with this in a pinch. We have a lot of thread on the top of our nut. Our nut is nicely secured. We have our spacer in place. Now I'm ready to relieve the pressure on the spring, and this strut assembly is back together. I'm going to repeat the process on the other side, and then we're ready to install this back into the truck once I install the upper mount spacer. All right, so we got all the pressure off our spring. Everything is in its place where it's supposed to be. Our marks are all lined up. Now I've got our top piece set in place onto the factory studs, and we're going to use our factory hardware to fasten our upper mount onto our strut, and we're going to torque those down to 30 foot-pounds. All right, now that we got our struts nicely built, we're ready to remove our factory upper control arms. There's a bolt on either side. Get those out of the way, and then we're going to assemble the ones for our Readylift kit. So to remove our upper control arm from the factory, I have a 13/16 socket and a ratchet. You can use a 21 millimeter as well, and just get onto the head of the bolt. There's actually a flag nut on the inside, so you don't have to worry about holding anything on the inside as you remove it. Just spin it out, get the bolt out, get the flag nut out, and this entire assembly will come out of the vehicle. And there we go. All right, now to install our bushings, what you're going to want to do, just put both of the bushings into your new arm on either side. And then what we're going to do, we're going to take a little bit of grease, put it onto our crush sleeves. Give that a little bit of lubrication so it can go into our bushing. And then we're just going to start this by hand. Kind of feel when it goes into the other side. Wipe off the excess grease. And you can give it a little bit of a tap just to center it up. Make sure both bushings are inside the arm, not one side is pushed out. And that's all there is to it. Then we're going to double check, make sure that our plastic plug is towards the rear. And we got everything on the right side. And we're just going to put it where our factory A-arm was and reinstall with the factory hardware. And we're not going to tighten it just yet. All right, now we're ready for our strut assembly. We're going to use the supplied nuts in the kit to go onto our spacer for the top of our strut assembly. Get this into place and get these hand tight. And you'll find when you put your strut in, it's actually going to turn it 180 degrees from its original position. So it took a tiny little bit of convincing. I actually had to back off the strap a little bit just so I could move the whole control arm down a little bit just to line up our whole strut assembly with the bottom hole. But I got our bolts started. Just gonna have to knock it all the way back into place. We'll put the nut on the end and everything is still gonna remain finger tight at this point. So next what we're gonna do is we're gonna take the castle nut off of our upper control arm, our ball joint. And then we're gonna grab our spacer from the kit, which looks just like that. We're gonna line up our knuckle with our new ball joint. Just like so. And then we're going to tighten our castle nut to 65 foot-pounds and install the supplied cotter pin. So now what they want you to do is actually just take a zip tie and zip tie your ABS wire to the brake hose. And for me, I went one step further and I put some split loom over top of the brake hose itself, just to give you that little added extra protection. Just so if the zip tie ever were just to cut into this or something like that, it's just a little bit more peace of mind for me. And I didn't see any zip ties in the kit, so I did have my own, and this is something you're probably going to want to have kicking around your shop regardless, but just note that I didn't find any in the kit. And you're going to want these snug so they're not going to move around, but not so tight that you're going to restrict your brake hose. Now we can reinstall our brake line retainer bolt up over here, and they say to torque it to 5 foot-pounds. I'm going to use my little 1/4 inch impact. There we go. Now we're going to grab our grease gun. We're going to grease our upper ball joint. So now we're going to reattach our sway bar link. Push that into the sway bar, put on our factory hardware, and torque to 35 foot-pounds. All right, so I've been following along with Readylift's instructions on how to do all this, kind of following their order. And it turns out they definitely do tell you to take the axle nut off, but they do not tell you to put it back on. And they also don't give you a torque spec for it. So it's something they forgot. Also, the tie rod end, they don't tell you to put that back on either. Unless I'm totally missing something in the instructions, but I went back and checked about 3 different times to make sure that I wasn't just not reading something. But yeah, they don't give you a torque spec for this, and they also don't tell you to put it back on. I mean, common sense would tell you to put it back on, but it would be nice to know how much to tighten it to. So I went online, I did a little bit of digging, and it's really hard to find specs for these newer trucks. But I found that a very common axle nut torque is 185 foot-pounds, so that's what we're going to go with on this one. That's a pretty comfortable number for myself. So at least both sides are tightened exactly the same. That will affect the wear of this bearing. If you over tighten it, you can cause issues for yourself. So 185 is what I'm going with. Don't quote me on that one. It could be a little bit more, it could be a little bit less, but I think that one will work. And we will tighten those up and move on to the next step. So at this point, we've tightened down the axle nut, and one thing I do before I tighten up the axle nut, I make sure that it's seated in the splines. I give it a couple of turns, make sure that everything is nicely aligned. Sometimes if you pull too far on this CV axle, sometimes you gotta kind of pop back into place, but everything seems to be turning really nicely. We got our tie rod end back on and tight. We have our upper ball joint nut torqued and pinned, and now we're ready to lower it down with the tire on. And then we're going to tighten up the top 3 on the top of the strut to 30 foot-pounds. And then we're going to tighten the top 2 mounting bolts on our upper control arm. And those, I believe, are going to go to 125 foot-pounds. It's important to tighten all this stuff down at ride height, because if you tighten it down now, it's in full droop. And then everything is tight. And then when the pressure of the tire goes up, it's going to want to twist everything. So it's always good to torque everything at ride height. But now for the exciting part, we're going to lower down the truck. We're going to take our 2 front wheels out of the bed of the truck. We got our hub centric rings on already. See how this thing looks with this brand new wheel and tire package. And look at that, we have our wheel in place. We still have to do our final torque on the lug nuts. The truck is still not at ride height just yet. I think what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna install the rear spacers, get all that done, and then we're gonna tighten up everything when everything is settled down on all 4 tires. So for now, we're just gonna lift it back up and carry on with the rear. All right, so now first things with the rear, first thing you wanna do is support your rear axle. I got a spin jack under there, so everything is nicely supported. I've got some of the weight of the rear end on that. So now what we're gonna wanna do is just loosen all of our 4-link bolts. There's 4 bolts, you don't wanna take them out, you just wanna loosen them. They're also gonna loosen our track bar bolts, but not take out the hardware. And then we're gonna have to remove the lower shock hardware and the little bolt that holds the brake line to the frame and our sway bar link. We're gonna remove the upper part of that and we're ready to move on. And now that we got everything loosened and or disconnected, ready to lower down the rear end, take the pressure off the springs, and we can pull the springs out of the truck. So when you are lowering down the rear axle, you just wanna keep an eye on your ABS wire and your brake line. Make sure that you still have a little bit of flex there. You don't wanna stretch these out too far. And it's very crucial that you undo this bracket. Otherwise, you're gonna put a lot of stress on this line. But now that we got it dropped down, just gonna grab hold of our spring, lift it up, and out of the way. So now that we have our rear springs out, we're gonna take the upper isolator. There's 2 locating tabs. You're just gonna wanna take a pair of side cutters or a cutter of some sort. Just gonna cut those flush off and get ready for our next step. Then we're gonna install our bump stop extension up here on the axle pad with the provided 1/4-inch bolts. And these are universal side for side. All right, so we got our bump stop extensions mounted onto the pads on the axle. And I gotta admit, they are a little tricky, just kind of getting the nut washer kind of in place. You gotta be a little bit kind of fiddly with your hands to be able to get everything lined up. But after a little bit of time, you will get it into place. These are nicely tightened down. Now we're ready to put our spacer on the top. Then we're gonna reuse our factory isolator and install our springs. All right, so we have the truck on its own weight and it is so much bigger than it used to be. It's absolutely awesome. I do have 2x4s under the front wheels right now. That kind of lets the wheels kind of go out on their own because with the rubber it'll grip and you have to kind of drive it to allow it to settle. But a little trick, if you do put a 2x4 underneath, it'll kind of skate out the 2x4 and kind of find its own ride height. But we're gonna let this thing sit overnight. My battery, my camera is pretty much dead. And then I'm gonna tighten up everything on its actual ride height. And then we can see what this thing looks like in the daylight. Well, everybody, it's the next day. It is a bit of a cool one today, but we're gonna get everything nicely tightened up on the truck. And we should be ready to see how our fitment is on the front as far as any rubbing or anything like that. And then we're headed off to the alignment shop, get this thing all straightened out, ready to go. And then we've actually got something else we're gonna be doing to this truck today. So it's gonna be a busy one. Let's get it done. Well, everybody, after crawling around on the ground for probably about an hour, torquing all the bolts, I am finally done. It's time to fire the truck up, back it out the door, let the suspension settle a little bit, and then I'm gonna move the boards out of the way, pull it back in, and we're gonna measure it in the same spot that we measured it before and see what the difference is. So now that things are pretty well settled, let's check our height. And in the front, we are at 42.5. And in the rear, we are sitting at 43.25. So definitely got a whole bunch of lift. We'll see what it's like after it settles after driving it for a few days, but that's our initial measurements. just look at that. That is a huge difference. I mean, I didn't think 35s were gonna be that big of a difference. And honestly, I only have a tiny little bit of rubbing when I had it on full lock. And I still have my WeatherTech mud flaps on, which most people I've seen with this setup have taken off. So it's gonna keep from getting all kinds of junk all over the truck all the time, like before I had mud flaps. So, I mean, all in all, if we have to do a little bit of trimming, we'll do that too. I have the center caps left off for now because I am gonna retorque these wheels after driving for a little bit. So let's get on the road and see how this thing drives.